Hello, hello. This is Alex Burkett, and you are listening to the Long Game Podcast. This is a part of our Kitchen Side series where we pull back the curtain and we show you the behind-the-scenes conversations, debates, strategies, and brainstorming sessions that we have at our agency. This was a pretty deep episode with some strange topics. The three core topics that we covered were doing nothing as your biggest threat or your biggest competitor, so inaction or paralysis. The second one is cope creep, so that's a new term. The last one is life lessons that I learned from Es Devlin, one of my favorite artists. In the first one, we really turned this into a broader discussion of human motivation, team motivation, action, momentum, and how to make decisions, strategic as well as tactical decisions, as well as incentivize risk-taking. In effect, many teams and individuals suffer from analysis paralysis, the paradox of too many choices, and the fear of messing up. Fear is the big emotion, especially in B2B. Therefore, the status quo is often the safest bet, and it's often the one that people choose, doing nothing. This is your biggest threat as a marketer or business leader, not your competitors. The biggest threat is the status quo, but it's also a big threat to your own personal productivity and the impact of your team that your team can have. So we walk through some models that we use to beat this while mitigating risk, like two-way doors versus one-way doors, experiments, minimum viable experiments, risk-weighted portfolios, and other mental models. Cope creep was a fun one, all about the human ego. We all have this tendency, we all do this. It's basically our tendency to diminish other people's success or other brand success through cope, caveats, justifications, alternative views, narratives, or to justify our own failures via cope and sour grapes. I didn't want that anyway, right? Finally, on a personal note, I went to a museum recently and serendipitously met one of my favorite artists who had an exhibition there. Es Devlin. So I shared two awesome lessons that she talked about. One was about tracing, and one was about maintaining your unique style while working with collaborators. So please enjoy this episode of the Long Game Podcast. I felt really embarrassed because I did the podcast with Nate from Positional, and I posted a clip, and Dave Fillarme hit me up and was like, "Hey man, you look like the guy from No Country for Old Men." He's like, "You look horrible." Should we jump in?
Where do you want to start today?
Let me list a couple topics off. So I met Es Devlin this weekend, and she's my favorite artist, and she was very profound. I can tell you about a couple life lessons that I learned from her. Cope creep, that's a new term that I've been playing around with. I thought about this a couple weeks ago. Basically, you know how people say scope creep, right? You sign up for a project, this gets added in, this overhead gets added in, and all of a sudden you've got like twice the length of the project, and you're like, oh shit, how did this happen? Cope creep is totally different. I just thought it was like an insidious tendency to like justify failures or other people's success, right? Like people are like, oh yeah, this company, they're crushing it in terms of traffic, but I bet the content's not engaging. I bet it doesn't convert. Mm-hmm. Cope creep. They used to do that with A/B testing. They'd be like, oh, we didn't win the test, but gosh darn it, we learned something. Yeah, exactly. It's just coping with failure. Do nothing as your biggest competitor, I think, is pretty interesting. The topics that have occupied my mind the last couple of weeks have really been around like this knowledge to execution gap. So like in a world of abundant information, like why are we doing nothing? Why is it so hard to get people to take action, to execute, to drive forward results and momentum? I think that's a pretty rich one. And then do you have any others that, David, I thought you had a couple that you wanted to bring up, the last one that we didn't get time for.
The question of like whether search quality is getting worse and why. I actually think that the things you brought up are really interesting around doing nothing is the biggest competitor. I guess for us as an agency, but also internally, teams just not doing anything. It's like they don't need to worry about their competitors. It's like them not doing anything and getting paralyzed by fear of failure or analysis paralysis is actually going to be a thing that impacts them much more than the competitor they can see.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let's just dig into that area and see where it takes us. Cause I think it's one of those areas that you could go a million different directions. But the grandfather question here to me, like the question of all questions is why does anybody do anything? Like, I think that's the root of what I'm trying to get at. Like, what is like the motivational factor to invest in SEO, to build a company, to like do the work? Like, that's the deep rooted question. And then there's obviously surface layer stuff. Like, if you're, the reason this question came to my mind was because I started reading April Dunford's new book about sales messaging. Anyway, like
Jolts, is that what it's called?
I don't remember what it's called. I should probably know this. We'll correct that and link to it in the show notes. But she talks about in the first chapter, she's like, you think it's hard to sell software. It's my argument that it's way harder to buy software nowadays. Mm-hmm. A lot of that's due to fear of fucking up, which we've talked about before. And there's just an abundance of options. So actually the best course of action is often the status quo. So it's not to invest in that new tool. It's not to invest in anything risky or like put yourself out on the ledge. Because if you're doing nothing changes, right? Like the status quo is safe. So as a marketer or somebody selling software, you have to overcome that hurdle of the status quo more than anything.
What do you mean harder to buy? Like the process of buying or the process of trusting enough to make a purchase?
It's like empathizing with the software buyer, right? So put yourself in the position of maybe a director of marketing who just joined let's say Series C, Series D, like a later stage company. Things are a little bit easier at a startup. You've got less red tape, you've got less budget, but you're not going to get punished for making a bad decision, right? But you've got a significant budget that's going to be included for like headcount, for, advertising. Like you have a lot of money, but it doesn't go that far because you have so many things you want to do. And then you're looking at getting, say, God, what would be a piece of software? Let's say like AI, like a generative AI writing tool. And let's pretend they're not all like $20 a month or it's like ChatGPT or some shit. Like it's actually expensive. Like it's like a CMS level price. It's hard to buy, not just because there's a lack of information, but because if you buy the wrong tool and it doesn't get implemented, you are on the line for that. Right. Yeah. You not only wasted money, thus, presented an opportunity cost where you could have put that into SEO with Omniscient Digital. But you also, you're on the line. You look like an idiot to your boss.
Yeah.
So it's hard to be a buyer.
I honestly, from firsthand experience, think about this anytime I'm pitching to y'all or the team about like, hey, let's move from Asana to ClickUp, for example. That was a big one, right? And it's not just the fear of whether people will use it. It's the fear of, is this the best tool that I should be using? And then having to compare everything side by side and realizing that a lot of this software actually does almost the exact same stuff. And then having to figure out the nuances of what each one has or doesn't have. And that's just a lot of time. And then you want to make sure that at the end of it all, you're making the right call. So there's some form of analysis paralysis there. There's also just like, honestly, frustration at all these commoditized options now where maybe choice is good for consumers or buyers, but it's actually just frustrating. And it's hard because sometimes they're pitching themselves as the best solution. And once everyone's doing that, it's hard to be actually clear about it. So you kind of just have to make a bet and commit to one, I think. And that's the part I think a lot of people have trouble with, whether it's figuring out where to invest marketing or figuring out the best software to buy. It's a lack of willing to have conviction behind a decision for fear of failure or whatever. And that's been really top of mind for me as I observe like how we grow our business, watching our clients figure out how they invest in marketing, and honestly, like seeing Lisa's classmates in business school figure out like their career options, because they have all the options available to them. And it's hard for them to pick once you have all those options available.
Well, there was a book written about this a long time ago, The Paradox of Choice. I can't remember the author, and I didn't even read the book. I just read summaries, but I think the studies are apparent too. It's like they did a study about like, I think it was jam, like jelly, and they gave like 3 options versus like 30 options or something like that. And then rated people's satisfaction with their choice after the fact. And the people who had 30 choices, I'm making these numbers up. This is so fucking ancient in my memory bank. But the people who had more options were less satisfied with their inevitable decision. But that doesn't make sense rationally, right? Like you would think if you have more options, you're going to be able to maximize your choice architecture and choose the best possible jam for you. It's not true. So I said the word maximizer, right? Like that was the phrase that he came up with. It was like maximizer, satisfier, and then the in-between zone, it's a satisficer, right? You want to be like I actually can't remember what satisficer means. It's like a blend between a maximize. It's like you have a threshold, but you're satisfied with the choice and you just commit and choose that choice. You don't think about the regret of like, oh, like if I have a Snickers, Twix, Reese's, all these other options and you choose the Snickers, you're like, fuck, I should have chosen the Reese's cups, right? Like you say, all right, I'm not going to probably make the best choice, but I'm going to be really happy with the fact that I chose the Snickers.
Yeah.
And I think this is like, obviously people see the parallels in this with like dating markets and dating apps and stuff like that. It's like, you go on Tinder or Hinge, you've got like a million options, right? And does it make anybody happier? I think probably there's studies that would say no.
Yeah. I might be going in a different direction here, but I'm reading this book called How Will Your Life Be Measured by Clayton Christensen, who also wrote Innovator's Dilemma. And one of the things he talks about it is similar to this idea of analysis paralysis and not being able to make decisions, mainly because it's in a vacuum, and how there are just so many assumptions baked into every decision. And especially if you're a maximizer, trying to make sure that you're making the best decision for this situation or getting the most ROI out of this marketing channel. You don't just make that decision without any data. Like if you're trying to decide between SEO and paid and where to put all your money, you don't just decide to put all your money into paid. You might start with a small budget here and then like see if it's validated or not. And I think it's similar in whether it's in buying software or choosing a vendor. Like you do a pilot with the vendor, you like trial the software before you pay for it for yourself, before you decide to roll it out to your team, rather than just making a decision in a vacuum. And he talked about this in terms of like careers too, like maybe get a part-time internship before you decide to commit your career to this path in consulting or whatever it is. And so there are ways, I think, when it feels like doing nothing is probably the easiest choice because the decision feels so hard, there's a way to lower the risk or the perceived risk of the decision so that like, you have more information or data to work from so that you do feel better about the ultimate decision you make.
Yeah.
You're talking about the concept of like two-way doors. I think that's a Jeff Bezos term.
Yes.
It's like you can walk in this door and you can also walk out. It's not like an irreversible decision. And then there's certain decisions that are one-way doors. If you commit, you're pretty much committed. If you marry somebody, it's like a one-way door in most cases, right?
I mean,
obviously, yeah, like we don't need to say the exception, but actually, I know that divorce exists. But like generally speaking, you say to death do us part.
I think like I'm sure having more choices makes it feel more pressurized to make the right choice out the gate. But I also see the same way you said, kind of small doses, David. Like sometimes making the wrong choice is part of the journey. And I hate that phrase in this context because it sounds kind of like wishy-washy, but I mean, you wouldn't know if ClickUp was the right choice had we not gone through Asana or other things like that. Like part of that is, I think, the process of growing and building on the business. And it's a little bit different when buying software because you've got migrations and implementations and all kinds of things that come with it. So it's not like buying a different mac and cheese and it's like, oh, I'm not going to get this one next time. But I think sometimes like to alleviate the pressure, it's like, yeah, sometimes it's going to fucking suck until you figure out the right answer. For me personally, that's really made it easier to make choices and keep moving forward. Because you all know I'm a chronic overthinker. If I really tried to make the right choice the first time, I wouldn't make any choice at all.
What about this paradox, though, that we talk about with organic search and content marketing, where you can't really test it, right? Like you can't dip your toes in the water and actually see what the results are going to be. So on one level, you do have to commit to this to see the actual results. So it's not really like freelancing or doing internships to test a bunch of jobs, right? Like you can't really test SEO. So I do find that like in some cases, like, like people talk about LinkedIn and like building thought leadership there. It's like you post once a month, you're not really going to you can't prove it out based on that test.
I'm kind of coming around to that. Like maybe the test isn't exactly like doing a little bit here and there, but I did speak to a prospect and they're like, yeah, last year we published 30 articles with like a contractor and we did our SEO research and all of that to figure out what to write about. And then we just stopped because we wanted to see like, would that actually get any sort of traffic? And she was like, yeah, it's getting some traffic. It's not a lot, but it told me that we can actually rank for some of these keywords. She's like, now I want to invest more.
Yeah.
Something I'm also speaking to a lot of clients about. And they're like, hey, should we should we invest in SEO? And I'm like, what have you done around like paid or SEO or produced any content at all? And they said, no, we don't even know what keywords to go after. I'm like, you should probably at least do some paid marketing to figure out what converts and have a starting point. Like, it's probably not going to be the best apples to apples comparison, but at least you'll have some data to know what converts and what doesn't. And so when I say testing SEO, it's not like, let's publish one article to see if it works. It's more of, like, you have to give it some sort of effort and then maybe even have a different standard for what success looks like. Like, you don't say you write 4 articles and expect X number of leads to come through to validate it.
Yeah. Just going from like 0 to like 0.1, seeing if it moves like the needle at all.
Well, it's increasing your sample size. Like if you're talking in terms of an actual randomized controlled trial, you just set a higher bar. It's going to cost a little bit more. It's not going to be as cheap as 4 articles. Maybe it's 40 articles, right? You have to set a reasonable minimum viable threshold to make that decision. And then you also have to map out the overall impact. If it were to succeed, if it were an excellent grand slam, super successful channel, what's the overall impact? And then you can gauge that against other potential efforts, right? So if it's not going to be that much, even if you do really well, then maybe you're not going to test that in the first place.
Yeah.
Yeah. This reminds me of, we're really trying to encourage like a culture of experimentation across the team as we grow. And one way I've carved out space of thinking about this is like, there's going to be 10 to 20 to 30%, probably max 25% of our day to day that may or may not work. Right. I think as we grow, and especially as the 3 of us get, stretched thin, it's hard to work on things that may or may not work. You're like, I want every second, everything I do, I want it to move us forward. I want it to be successful, or however you define something working. Right. But honestly, I think the way that you grow is you create space for quote unquote failure. And I would say that too, for businesses that want to test SEO, it's like, yeah, you can't just do one article. Like you have to do 30 to 50 or whatever the amount is. And that's going to cost you some money and it's going to take some time and it might not work, but like, what if it does? So setting the expectation of like, this is worth trying. If it doesn't work, then not to go back there. But if it does, the potential is massive. And I would love for prospects to bring us that data. Hey, we ran an experiment in 2023. Here's what worked. Here's what didn't. And that makes whatever kind of agency or in-house relationship you build even more fruitful because you've laid this strong foundation, and then those people can, take it and run with it.
For what it's worth, I struggle with this myself in certain experiments that we've run on driving clients and leads for the agency. It's like not always certain how much we should be, like how much runway we should give an experiment before we call it.
Yeah.
So like running LinkedIn ads or paid ads, like, people think that it's instant, but it's not. It's like you have to find remarketing pools. You have to have the right creative and the right copy, the right targeting. And then still there's a certain amount of time that it takes to actually get a qualified lead who raises their hand and says, hey, I want this quite expensive service. Sales development, like I'm not totally sure what the timeline is on all of these. So sometimes I've debated back and forth in my mind, like, are we calling these experiments too early? The opposite is also bad too. It's like you got a sunk cost and you're like, I don't want to give up yet, and you keep it running forever and just waste a bunch of time and money. But I don't think it's necessarily clear, even with non-SEO channels, what that timeline is.
This is the stuff that I love because I don't think these are the things that have clear, objective, correct answers, which as business owners, we run into a lot of these decisions. And even using the LinkedIn ad remarketing experiment, I'll call it as an example, there could have been a case to say, hey, this might be making immeasurable impact on our pipeline, and we should keep working with this agency to run these remarketing ads. But we just said, hey, instead of spending the money here, let's go spend it over here instead and just make a call. Like, sure, you can make a case for it, but let's just make a call and move forward so that we're not constantly thinking about whether this is worth continuing investment or not. Because the do nothing there is continue to spend a couple $1,000 a month and maybe it's working, versus maybe spend it over here where we have a different hypothesis and test that out instead. And so these are the types of questions we get from clients too. And the answer is always, it depends. And here's how I would think about it. And there is no right answer. And I think even just being able to tell them there's no right answer, but here are the things to consider in making this decision, and here's what we recommend, helps them, because they're often looking for the right answer, some certainty that they're making the right decision. And they just need someone to tell them there is no right decision. Like, this is kind of a bet.
Or anything can be the right decision. I think that's something that I've been thinking about recently. Like in the fitness and health world, people say now. It's like any diet works. Like if you, adhere to it and actually like track your macros and like if your goal is weight loss, you eat less than you're burning on a daily basis. Like you can do paleo, you can do vegan, just stick with it. Like, and I talked to Alethea on the podcast that just came out, and she talks about that with marketing tactics. She's like, here's the dirty secret is all of them work. You just got to pick and choose like your, expected value versus risk and reward, opportunity costs, like what the most viable path is for you and your business. Like, and that's where strategy comes in. But like, fundamentally, if you put enough time and effort into something, and especially if you have examples from similar companies or, if you have historical data that says this can work, you could probably make it work too. Should you? That's a different question.
I wonder if this plays into it, but this comes up every few episodes or so, but there are just so many different people posing as influencers or people who know what they're talking about, kind of shilling their methodology or philosophy to things. There's just so much of it that I think for a person who maybe is earlier on in their career or is prone to being influenced by these folks, it's going to feel like you're missing out on. If you make one decision, you're saying no to all these other things, which is inherently required for strategy, but those trade-offs might be hard for people to accept.
I really think that's a dangerous thing that's happening right now because, on one hand, you don't want to stick to something that's not working. If you're in a bad relationship, you should leave the relationship, right? Like you don't want to like just maintain because you've been in a situation, because you've been investing in something. But more common nowadays is whiplash and the constant flipping back and forth between like the shiny object. And the shiny object could be many things. That could be a new channel. It could be a new tactic, a new methodology, a new tool, or even a new audience. Like we've seen that with some clients where they're like, actually, we're going after this audience now. And it's like completely different from the people who have been paying them for the past 5 or 10 years. And if you do that too often, you can't expect to succeed in any one of those areas because something does take time and effort to show the real results. And like the platforms themselves are incentivizing this. So like LinkedIn is the one we always talk about, but you could say YouTube as well. It's really incentivizing somebody to come out with a flashy, hot, new take and a different way of doing things. And often, this is product marketing 101, you create an enemy. So it's like, not only is my thing the best, but that other thing, that's shit. And if you're still doing this, you're stupid, right? Like that's the implicit message behind a lot of this stuff. So then you read that and you don't really know what to do because it's actually not easy to know what to do. We go back to the, buying software is hard thing. It's the same thing. Strategy is hard.
Yeah.
So you think, oh shit, I'll jump on this bandwagon now. It seems like it's working for these people. And then 6 months later, you try a new thing and you're constantly in this hamster wheel of trying out new stuff.
I think sometimes it's easy to forget that marketers are just normal people that get caught up with all these like quick dopamine hits that we're now all subject to in like everyday life. So like TikTok or Instagram or shopping online or, having everything at our fingertips and getting caught up with the appeal of something new and something to look forward to. And it translates to our work lives very easily, especially if you like own your own company or run your own department. It can be enticing to always be working on something new and having like the potential ahead of you, right? Like the potential of this or the projection of this or really the feeling of hope, I think is kind of addictive. And it's definitely bled into professional decisions and how we field those decisions, right? Both in the analysis paralysis and also in like, this isn't really working. Oh, this is a great idea. Q2, I'm going to do this. My boss is going to love this. Like, and then you get to the end of Q2 and you're like, that's not really working. And depending on how much oversight you have, you can really run away with that and not have to prove the value or not have to wait, I think it's very rare now for bosses and leadership to be like, let's give this a year. I don't think you hear that anymore, which I don't know, depends on experience. Maybe they've been burned before and they're like, I'm not waiting for shit. But other times, sometimes you need to wait a year or 6 months at least, with our work. We're like, give us a year. And they're like, we don't have a year. So I don't know. It's tough. I mean, same with what you said, Alex, is like, depends on what channel. It really all depends.
Well, where's the aggressive patience? I think that's Eric, who's working with one of our clients. He mentioned that phrase and I really liked it because it's sort of the amp it up principle. You're narrowing your focus. You're choosing like strategically something to commit to, but you're also not fucking around. You're right. Not like just, oh yeah, we're going to take it slow and eventually it's going to happen magically. Like, you have to have some urgency and aggressiveness with which you're investing in the thing, but then also the patience to see it through to the end and like for a long time. Like I think
I love that.
That's the key.
I love that. I would rather our clients come to us and be like, I believe in what we're doing, but we need to do XYZ. Or what do you think about XYZ? Or if we're like, hey, this isn't working, we're going to change direction, but stick with us. We believe in this. Like making iterations within the larger strategy, the larger channel choice, and not being like, fuck this, we're moving on to a completely different island.
We're on YouTube.
Yeah. It's like, no, you can't change that every 3 to 6 months. Like nothing is going to stick.
So I'll take the other side of the argument. And it's not that I disagree, but when you think about the incentive structure and the reporting structure of organizations where every quarter they have to report to their board or to investors or whatever about what they're doing. So they're kind of on this quarterly or call it like twice yearly cadence of I need to deliver something in this quarter or in the 6 months to prove that I'm doing something. And so the time frame for seeing results decreases. So they might look for quick wins or hacks, and that might drive the pressure for people to keep trying new different things and jumping from one shiny object to another. And if you're trying to play the long-term game, if you're a marketer or even a manager or director, it's sort of like the director feels the pressure to report to the VP or C-suite about what their team's working on. The individual contributor is like, I don't know how much longer I'm going to be here. There's all these layoffs happening. I need to show my value like in the next 3 months, or I might get fired or something. I can see the pressures where it's hard to make an argument for long-term thinking when the way that things are set up, it incentivizes the like short-term wins. And so I don't know how to like grok that.
Yeah.
I think those are reconcilable, actually. I think that you want to have like, what was Stephen Covey, right? He wrote that 7 Habits book. It was like start with the end in mind. I think the best strategists do have sort of an end point or at least an ideal outcome, and they backcast towards that in terms of building the plan to get there. And then obviously like you want to do stuff fast and like acquire wins quickly. And like there's a ton of hacks or shortcuts that you can take. So in the context of SEO, like there's often interesting like low hanging fruit in terms of like page optimizations, speeding up link building in the early days. Like there's things you can do to expedite the timeline. But having that end in mind, I think they're, often two different camps, but I do believe those are reconcilable in my brain, at least. I don't know.
Yeah, I think like being able to identify the leading and the lagging indicators, which we do often with clients, like here's the early stage benchmarks we're looking for. This is not the finish line. This is just going to tell us if this is working. And when it starts to work, this is what you can look for and what you can bring to your higher ups to show them like this is moving in a good direction. With clients too, we've had clients come to us and they're like, we want to show the value of this program. We believe it, as in the team, CMO, CEO, whoever might be a little bit more skeptical. So we work together to pursue those quick wins. Wouldn't call them hacks. I hate the word hacks in our realm, but quick wins that maybe strategically they're not the deepest or the most impactful. But once we buy ourselves 6 to 12 more months, then we pull out that long-term strategy. But it's completely possible. I think it's just being able to identify, like, here's what early days, like the success in early days looks like for a YouTube channel, maybe building a stellar channel and your first 100 subscribers. Like it's not going to really do anything for the business immediately, but it's going to show whoever's asking, like, this is working. And here's what I'm going to do to continue to get it to work. And here's the ultimate finish line or, the milestone or the benchmark, whatever that I'm going for at in this timeline.
One thing that I think is important there is generating feedback quickly. And it doesn't maybe necessarily have to be results quickly. Hopefully it is. That helps a lot. But if you're generating a lot of action and it's sort of quiet, like there's nothing coming back to you, I think it's very difficult to say anything's going to happen. But in the case of YouTube, like even if the views aren't coming in, like if you can put those in an email campaign and like get feedback on how it's resonating or content in the hands of your existing customers. And if they think it's helpful, right? Like there's little ways you can get feedback cycles going and start to iterate. That's the big thing with action too. When people are sitting on the sidelines, it's like you do a minimum viable sort of growth model strategy session, and then generating action is the way that you generate data to inform the roadmap as you go. But I think like the absence of feedback is often, like if you don't really know if anything's changing, that's I would quit a lot of things if that was the case. If I was doing jiu-jitsu for a year and I didn't feel anything. Obviously in jiu-jitsu, it's different. You get feedback every session because you're fighting people, right? If you're like losing more or winning more when you're sparring. But imagine that wasn't the case and you didn't know and you were doing it for a year, 5 days a week. You're like, shit, should I do something else?
It sounds like it just comes back to the communication thing that I think we talk about a lot, where one, you need to know to communicate the stuff you're doing and also like how to communicate it all. Like you said, Ali, I think we have to do this with clients every now and then. And it's an exercise in education where they're saying, we want leads from content and SEO. And it's like, cool, we'll get there. But in the meantime, here are the metrics to show that there's progress being made. Like you jumped from being non-existent on the search results to now being on page 3, which is not page 2, but you were non-existent before. And then like, hey, you're up to the top of page 2. You're almost on page 1. Like you're not getting traffic leads yet, but there is progress being made and it with the activities that we're doing. And so maybe that should be the main takeaway here, where it's like, yeah, you're not going to go from 0 to 100 and deliver those results or wins immediately, but you can communicate progress and impact differently.
Yeah. One thing I really liked, and this is from a client, and I won't say the client just in case they don't want me to share this, but they've got a core principle that applies to multiple areas of their business, but especially their go-to-market, the really early stage. They've got a series of questions that starts, letter A, is what does extraordinary success look like? So you sort of paint that, end state, your outcome state. Question B is, who are similar people who are doing this and how are they doing this? That's what I was talking about with like historical data or patterns or like proving that this is possible. And then C is, how do we make this end goal possible? And then D is, what needs to exist for question C to be true? E is, repeat question C and D until you have a starting point. And then it goes on. There's a couple more items, but I really like that because it's setting the preconditions for success, not success itself, right? Like that's very assumptive to think that you're going to get to state A right away. It's really like, what are the preconditions that need to be established and working towards those, and then you build towards A.
Is this related to what you mentioned earlier around cope creep? Like, what if people use the preconditions as the measure of success, but they didn't actually hit success, but they're like, but we met these preconditions.
Well, that's where intellectual honesty and rigor comes in. Then you pick the wrong conditions. If it's not leading to success, then you did the exercise poorly. So cope creep. I like it. You're just trying to transition. That's very good moderator.
World's greatest moderator. No.
It's
TM Calacanis.
For the next topic.
You said at the beginning, but I don't think, and I really like the idea of cope creep, and I think I was guilty of it before, but
we all are.
I've never heard this phrase, so maybe for the listeners, like,
I don't think it's like creep? The worst.
It's not a phrase. So it's essentially, we all have egos. Cope creep is a play on words because everybody knows what scope creep is, especially if you're a consultant or in-house, right? Like you've got a project, you've got a budget, you've got a timeline, and then things get added on. There's like scope creep, right? Like never does a project actually complete in the timeline that you predicted. Cope creep has nothing to do with that. It just sounds similar and it kind of rhymes. But I see people on like social media just like shitting on other people's success and they'll be like, yeah, but like, is the traffic qualified, in terms of SEO, or yeah, but like, it's not really like brand, relevant. So like, is it really like resonating with their target audience? Like there's all kinds of like justifications and excuses. And it's like, I don't know, maybe. It's easy to say that from afar, but like maybe it does convert, maybe it doesn't. Who gives a shit? Like we're looking at a surface level metric and then kind of coming up with excuses as to why it's not great. And that's cope, right? Like cope is the sour grapes thing. It's like, oh, I couldn't get the grapes and fuck those grapes. I didn't want them anyway. They're bad grapes, right? And it happens with your own failures too. You can cope with different explanations, justifications, storytelling, data cherry picking. This was super, super common in A/B testing and CRO. So one of the biggest things that people would say is like A/B testing. It's not about the wins; it's about the learning, right? Like you're not actually optimizing for wins. But like if you ask your boss and your boss's boss and your boss's boss's boss, like what the point of all this is, they'd be like, to make more money. Right? It is to get those wins. And there is some truth, obviously, to learning. Like, there's a lot of risk mitigation with A/B testing. And like, you don't ship things that actually would have harmed your conversion rates or engagement metrics, et cetera. So it is about learning. But also it's about the wins, you know? I used to see this at HubSpot sometimes, and I wrote an article about it, about brand awareness, because I would hear, you know, certain
the one
phrases.
I wrote still ranks on page 1.
No. I was saying I wrote an article on brand awareness.
Oh, okay.
No, because well, I'm sure I quoted yours. Because I wanted to define brand awareness, because what would happen is people would talk about campaigns, they do a post hoc analysis and be like, well, we didn't drive any conversions. We got no users from this, but it definitely generated some brand awareness.
That
I was like,
brand, though.
The hell does that mean? Like, what are you talking about? Like, is that impressions? Is that engagement? Is that like people would know the brand name HubSpot more if you asked them if they knew it?
Yeah.
Like, so I went through this whole exercise of defining what it means, and I realized that the people who were saying it didn't know what it meant. It was actually just cope creep. It was saying like, well, this failed at the metric that we were aiming for.
Yeah.
But actually did something cool too, you know? It wasn't totally a failure.
The Super Bowl campaign was for brand awareness, but running a real campaign that has some estimated impact, like brand awareness is not like a fail-safe for that. It's like you said, cope creep. This is such an interesting phenomenon, I think, specifically across content, because most people come into content from journalism or creative writing, or they entered it through the lens of, I want to write more, and this is how I make money doing so. Every person I've interviewed in the last year, when I ask about weaknesses, mentions perfectionism. I don't know if that's just correlation, causation, whatever. Could be because my hiring footprint is very small.
It's because it's not actually a weakness, and people want to say it not. Anyway, go on. It's a bullshit answer.
So it's funny because I have done talks and presentations where it's like, it's not like you succeed or fail, it's you succeed or you learn. And I think the main takeaway was supposed to be like, it should be a process to get to the success, not just have nothing but failed experiments and hang your hat on that.
Yeah, I really do think that there's truth to that. Like, it's obviously like, again, going back to the constant analogy of jiu-jitsu, it's like I am actually there to learn. So like, you know, I guess that's my stated goal. So it's different in that case. But like, I think the broader point that I wanted to make is like, what do you want? And what are you doing to justify or like maintain your own ego and like your good feeling, right? Your own self-esteem. And like, if you broke that down, could you actually get more clarity on like what's missing? Because we all do this. Like, I do it all the time. You ever look at somebody who's successful and like, you know, they've got a crazy successful business and like, they're like hot and athletic and like, and you're like, yeah, but I bet they're not happy.
I don't know. I'm pretty happy.
You know, we do this all the time, and it's like, maybe they are. Like I saw the reason I actually thought of this was I love like Brian Holiday stuff, especially his old stuff. But he was on a clip and he was talking about how like, oh, success is more dangerous than failure. And like, again, to some extent, that's
Why?
true. Like, if he said specifically early in life, if you achieve a lot and you're very successful, you start to believe in your own hype and you're not humble, and therefore like pride before the fall. And I just thought, you know, like there's probably a lot of people who are really successful all of their life and they're not dealing with that. They're probably perfectly fine. We don't talk about them, you know? It's like that felt like cope creep to me. It's like, yeah, like maybe it's actually fine to be successful, like young, and maybe you never do fall.
Yeah, you don't hear about those people because there's no headlines.
Yeah.
There's no headlines to write about.
You don't know people's lives. They could be successful because they had a lot of micro failures that they probably didn't post on LinkedIn about. You know, like you don't know what they're dealing with day in and day out. And most people don't reach that level of success without messing up a lot, probably in private. But I don't think I believe that. I mean, maybe through the lens of like success is more dangerous than failure because you learn more from failure. And maybe when you're successful, you don't take a second and reflect on what you've learned. You just keep moving forward. It's kind of like the same winning and losing in sports. Like you probably learn more when you lose. But I don't know.
I think that's true, but I went to school in a small town and our football team sucked. We lost all the time and I didn't get any better at football. So I'm just saying, like, probably a large swath of people who lose a lot don't actually learn from their losses.
I didn't say a lot. I'm saying if it's like a mixed bag, you probably walk away from a loss with like, well, I'm not going to do that next time. If you lose a lot, I can't help you out with that, but
that's true. I just, we there's the narrative fallacy, right? Like we as humans want to structure everything in like some clean, linear pattern recognition narrative. And I just think like, I wanted to break that apart a little bit and be like, sometimes success is just success. It's just, they're doing really well. Like maybe there's no caveat. Sometimes failure just sucks and you can't actually learn that much from it. You just got to pick yourself up and go on to the next deal or the next fight or the next, whatever, the next game.
My takeaway is rather than looking at what other people are doing, just focus on your game.
Yeah.
Sure, other people are succeeding, but you don't need to, first of all, you don't have to shit on them. Second of all, why are you paying so much attention to that?
We love tearing other people down, though. You notice that? Like, as soon as somebody gets successful enough, it's really uncouth to tear somebody down when they're on their way up. But when they hit a certain point, we love tearing down celebrities, successful people. It's like there's something in us that just, it's like crabs in a barrel. Once you reach a certain status, it's your fair game.
Definitely jealousy.
Alex, you mentioned you had some life lessons from Es Devlin.
Yeah. I'm glad we saved this for the last part. I would have prioritized this earlier. But so I live in New York City and I went to a museum last weekend. It's like the Smithsonian Design Museum, Cooper Hewitt. And I went because Es Devlin has an exhibition. Basically, it's like a showcase of her life's work. And she's one of my favorite artists because, well, a couple of years ago, I went to one of her exhibitions in Miami, had a profound experience, partially influenced by psychedelics, but it blew me away. It was like this mirror maze, and it like was paralleling like your lungs and breathing with like trees and nature, and it was just wild. And then I saw some more of her work, right? She did the Super Bowl halftime show, the Dr. Dre, Snoop Dogg one as well as The Weeknd. She did Miley Cyrus's Bangers tour. She's very like experiential as an artist. So anyway, I was very excited for this. And I went to the thing and she was there. So she was doing an informal meet and greet, which was awesome. I didn't know about it. I got there and there was a line and we're like, what's this line for? And they're like, oh, Es Devlin's like doing like a meet and greet. And I was like, oh my God, this is crazy. So I quickly bought a book of hers so I could get it signed. And I went in and she did like 20 or 30 minutes of just like super intimate. Like there was 20 or 30 people in the room and most of them were artists, designers. I don't really consider myself in that crowd. I'm more of a mathy guy, I think. So I was just listening in and like they were asking really profound questions. One of which, so she starts all of her work, even though it's experiential and 3D and like in real life, she starts it all with the pencil and paper. And some woman asked the question, like, essentially boiled down to like, hey, I'm really bad with the pencil and paper. So like, how can I get that tactile brainstorming motion going? And Es Devlin, she's so fucking charismatic, by the way. She's so like articulate, just amazing to listen to. She's like, trace. Like, in fact, if you look at one of my pieces upstairs at the exhibition, all of those animals, I actually kept the traced outlines of those because there's, hundreds of, like there's tons of those. But she's like, actually, more often than not, I start by tracing because it at least gets my brain to hand connection to the paper and it starts my mind turning. And like, obviously, I'm not an artist, but I try to extrapolate lessons into what we do. And I'm like, there's a million ways that like I try to reinvent the wheel and I'm like not good at this thing. And I'm like, there's a million like templates and frameworks and things that can just get my brain started. So Allie, this project that we're doing now, I traced a lot of it. Like I was like, oh, like there are patterns that we've used before. It's basically like a big SEO audit. And I was struggling to figure out where to start, which is often a problem, right? Like the cold start problem. And I'm like, I'll just trace. Like, I'll just use these spreadsheet templates. I'll use this format that has worked before. And then my original thinking will kick in. And it did. So that was one cool lesson. The other one, this is probably less relevant to the business world, but I think it's relevant to us as business owners and probably writers, designers, anybody in a creative field. So she's got a very strong touch on her work. Like you can tell an Es Devlin piece when you see it. And she's collaborated with a ton of pop stars and like huge, like loud voices, right, with strong styles of their own. So the person asked, like, how do you maintain that sense of style, that sense of voice, like your own authenticity while working with so many collaborators who also have strong voices. And she had a really complicated, nuanced answer, but it boiled down to like, she's like, I don't always. There's been a whole like middle part of my career where I didn't do that. And you can see the work and it's actually not good. You know, I was too far on the other side of that spectrum. But her broader point was that as you go along in your career as an artist, designer, whatever, and you're going to work with a lot of people, you take things from them. Like a piece of them chips off and like you incorporate that into your own style and into your own voice. And then eventually, like you find that reemergence of what you wanted to say, what your style was. And like it's sort of an amalgamation of all the different influences. And I thought that was a really cool thing to think about. But, you know, I think like as we're business owners now, like there's probably been periods in our lives when we worked at other companies where we had to subdue a little bit of our own unique style, our own like authenticity. It certainly happened to me a couple times. And now we're in a place where we can let the freak flag fly a little bit. And it's like, it's not just like our own authenticity. It's like, actually those experiences rubbed off on me a little bit too. So I don't know, it kind of resonated with me.
That last one is really, I mean, the first one, yes, definitely figuring out a way to get started is something I'm always working on. But the last one makes me reflect on at least how I've sort of developed in my career, where sure, some of the people I've worked with in the past were very challenging to work with. And sometimes I had to kind of let them have their way, but there were things that I learned from them around like, oh, wait, how were they thinking about this thing? Or how did they carry themselves? Or how did they present this idea that ended up getting more buy-in? Yes, it was challenging to work with them, but I ended up being able to pull something out of that and make the most out of that experience. And even our styles as leaders in the company or as marketers, I somehow developed down the path of being a more mathy marketer, but I don't learn that in a vacuum. Like I had to work with people who had that, who thought very differently. And I just found that interesting and started moving in that direction based on influences from like Brian Balfour and Chris Miller at HubSpot and all that stuff that ultimately got me to where I am. Otherwise, like you can't just like be a purist and it's my style that I developed on my own or like my skill set or whatever.
That doesn't
like,
exist. Yeah.
No. Yeah, that doesn't exist. And two, it's important to kind of acknowledge that you're aggregation of all these experiences from different people, whether you liked working with them or not.
I should say too that in the first few pages of her book, she's got a bunch of concentric circles, and within those circles, so the circle is like a visualization of how she thinks about like the intertwining nature of all of her influences. But these circles are all the names of people that she's collaborated with through the years, and that's like the first few pages of how she started the book.
Oh, cool.
So it was awesome. Absolutely to your point on like the crediting and like it was like the preface to all of her work, which I found pretty illuminating as well.
Very sentimental.